course like this and reading a book like this is that it's a survey. It has to be a kind of a survey. He can't go into depth and all of the things that he brings up. But on the other hand, he's trying to be rigorous. So um, it can be difficult reading in the sense that he's trying to go below the surface, but he doesn't have enough space to really resolve and explain a lot of the things that he's doing. But that's okay. I mean, I do want you in this course to see what some of the answers are that philosophers have proposed to the kind of questions and problems that are raised. But I would say again that the most important thing is to see what the problem is and how it arises, rather than to um, be perfect about somebody's proposed explanation, because it is much more important to see the problem than to even to understand any particular philosopher's answer to the problem. But in the last part of this chapter, chapter two on mind, interesting that it ends the way that it does, and I think it's interesting because it helpfully reminds us that the topic that he's really getting into here, mind, is very complicated, and one of the complications is that mind seems to do and to contain so many different things. As he says at the end of the chapter on, I think it's called on thought, is that he has been concentrating on what he calls qualia, which are really associated with sensations, feelings, what it's like to be in pain, what it's like to taste coffee, and things like that. But the mind doesn't just contain those types of experiences, or we don't. Our mental experiences are not exhausted by those types of experiences. There's also something called thought, which seems to be a very different thing. Um, so at least at the end of this, we're reminded of the great variety of things that we call mental acts or mental states, that they really are not one type of thing. It's not just feeling pain or sensing, seeing a certain color. It's also having a thought, you know, and those seem to be very different types of things. Very interesting little thing about color there. I mean, really, what is that argument there about color and the so-called inverted spectrum argument meant to establish? I think if you remember the way that he opposes Locke and Leibniz, the two philosophers earlier in the chapter, where Locke seems to believe that there's really no rational connection that we can understand between the physical causes of our sensations and what we actually sense, that they're two utterly different things and you can't really connect them. Whereas Leibniz seemed to suggest that that's wrong. That is, that there must be a rational connection between whatever the physical impacts on our senses, bodies are, and the resulting mental states, that they are different things, but that there must be a correlation between them. And really, the section on color, I think, is an argument in favor of Leibniz, and I think he comes out and says that. That is that we can imagine, I suppose, beings who are conscious who experience the world in very different ways than we do. But how different could they experience the world, given what we know about the physical basis for our experience of color? It would seem that although the causes of seeing the color yellow for a human being and the actual experience of yellowness are very different things, that it would seem that there is a correlation between them. That is, that there are reasons that under certain conditions we see yellow as opposed to blue, as opposed to brown, and that there may be certain physical constraints that suggest that certain subjective experiences of color would be impossible for any creature to experience. I mean, that, for instance, a bright brown or a transparent white would seem to be subjective experiences that would be impossible for any creature, given the physical basis for color perception. And that is an argument against the so-called I believe, mutant variation, the idea that there are conscious beings whose mental lives are entirely sort of different and incomprehensible to us, that there may be some fairly easily pointed out physical constraints to our mental lives. And that's a very interesting argument there about color, I think. But the last little section is about thought. And one of the things that is introduced there is the idea of thought, that thoughts can have symbolic significance. And this is, of course, tied up with the phenomenon of language, that having a perception of something does not necessarily mean that perception, that subjective experience, is representational in its nature. He says, you can have an experience of yellow or orange or square or pain or these things, and they're not necessarily indicative of anything beyond themselves. They're just there. We just experience them. But there's something different about thought. If I have a thought about American mailboxes and the fact that they're blue, it would seem that my thought points beyond itself to something in the world, that it has intentional content, that it has symbolic content, that my thought not only is sort of sitting there in my mind for me to be experienced, but that the whole point of my thought, being a thought, is that it's about something. That aboutness can be, of course, can be self-referential. I can think about myself. But it would seem that, just as deeply rooted in my belief is that I can think about things beyond myself, and that thoughts themselves are mental contents that have a very strange nature because they point beyond themselves, thinking of this, believing in that, that these mental contents are not simply sort of sitting there in my mind to be experienced, but that they have a purpose or function too, and that function seems to be, one of its functions at least, thought seems to be representational. That is, thought itself points beyond the mind to something beyond the mind, which, I don't know what to make of that in terms of how to relate that to, say, Cartesian dualism or alternatives to Cartesian dualism, but it would certainly be something that they would have to take into account.